Well, thank you guys for coming tonight. Thank you, Professor Pugliese. Thank you for amazing organization, and thank you to Adam. Tonight is a third event, of the series. Hopefully, next semester, we'll have more. And I decided. I mean, when I asked Adam to come here because his heritage is also Italian American, and I've been knowing Adam for many years, probably over 15 years, and he has a passion for Italian culture. He's gonna tell you more about it. He's actually shooting a project in Italy as we speak. And Adam, if you Google him, is practically there are millions of pages. But Adam directed many episodes of Breaking Bad, 30 Rock, Fargo, Californication, Law and Order SVU, Better Call Saul, and he's also a writer as well. And what I kind of would like to, first of all, I'm gonna leave the word to Adam now, but to tell us a little bit more about himself. And then we're gonna start talking about heritage and what's the representation of heritage, how much it matters for his work, his writing, his directing, and also what he witnesses when it comes to heritage. Is that still going on now in the TV and film industry? Is something that with the streaming platform?
Technically, because I would be eligible to become a citizen, to actually become an Italian citizen, have an EU passport. Through my grandparents. I guess the rule is right now that if your mother or father at the point where they were born, if your grandparent was still an Italian citizen, then you could become eligible to become an Italian citizen by blood. I call it
by blood.
And I was like, all right, well, I think and so I went off on this giant search for documentation, because you have to provide a really detailed set of documents. You have to have birth and death certificates for everybody, marriage certificates, naturalization certificates. If there's mistakes in someone's birth certificate, you have to go to court and get it corrected. It was and I gave up many times. I started, and then I'd be like, I'm never going to find my grandfather's birth certificate because he was born out of wedlock. He was adopted by this other family. How can I find it? My cousin Danny, he found the Holy Grail, the grandfather's birth certificate. But I just kept on giving up because it seemed overwhelming. But during the pandemic, it was a time when everyone had a lot of time on their hands. I was like, you know what? Let me try to finish the job. And I finally was able to assemble all the paperwork, and I was lucky to get an appointment, and the people at the consulate were really super nice, and I was actually able to become a citizen. But it was funny. It was the process was really interesting, because I got a letter saying that I was registered to be an Italian citizen in New York at the consulate, but I wasn't really a citizen until I was registered in the town where my grandfather came from, and I had to wait for that. So finally I got this Italian passport, and I was like, oh my, I can't wait to test drive this. But I was working in England for about 4 months doing a TV show there. And at the end of that, I went to Rome, and I was lucky. I got to meet some Italian production companies, and now I'm embarking on a job in Italian English language TV show that's going to be shot in Rome. That's going to happen over the next 4 months. So it's exciting. I've been trying to Riccardo had been my professor for a while, and got me started trying to improve my Italian. And then during the pandemic, this period where I had a lot of time, I tried. So I've gotten to the point where I'm probably a proficient speaker. So that's my Italian adventure, which is intersected with my directing adventure.
That's perfect. Talking about Italian adventure, what kind of difference do you see in working with Italian in Italy and working here? We were speaking before during like a small break. So what kind of difference do you see, like in approach to work, writing, production in general?
That's a great question. I think in Italy, I noticed that the quality, the technical quality of like the people that do the wardrobe, that do the sets, that do the cinematography, the level is incredibly high. Like the visual level, like if you ever see shows, like a lot of shows made in Europe, they look amazing. The system of writing is completely different because the American industry is driven by writers. Like the American TV industry is like a writer's industry. And there's a good reason for that, because the hardest thing on a TV show is to have 12 good, 20 good episodes for the season, to write them in a timely manner and have the level to be engaging and have it be at a really high level. That's the hardest thing. Directors, I hate to say it, but they're secondary. The directors are there more to kind of execute what the job is. In Europe, for me, it's really fun because the tradition is more like an auteur tradition, where it's more director-based, where the director has a lot more purview to like change the script or have ideas. It's more collaborative. It's more deferential towards the director, which is weird for me. But that was a joke. I was joking. But yeah. So it feels like the director is held in Europe. The director is held in more esteem, and has has more agency, like in the different parts of the creative pie. I mean, just to make it more clear, like in TV in the US, there's pilots and there's episodes, right? So if you're doing the pilot of a show, you're a partner of the writer. You're helping the writer decide what the show's going to look like, what the cast is going to be, where you're going to shoot it, what the music. You're involved in everything, but in partnership with the writer. Once that show goes to series, that writer, what they need more than anything else are more writers. And their life becomes consumed with the writer's room, with like planning the season, writing the stories, executing those scripts. The directors kind of are more rotate through the process. So if you're a pilot director, you get to have your fingers in all the different areas. But once you're just doing an episode of TV, your job is more limited to kind of the visual execution of the show, like how you're going to stage it, where you're going to put the actors in the space, what shots, what coverage you're going to get, deciding how much coverage you can get in the day and still make the day, monitoring the performances. A lot of times on a TV show, like the main actors, well, the people that are like the series regulars, they more or less patrol themselves. You don't have to do a lot of directing of performance with someone who's got a series regular role. Whereas someone who's a guest actor will want the help of the director. So I would say the purview of the episodic director is more about coverage, performance, time management. So I guess in Italy and in Europe in general, directors have a lot more responsibility on a show. There might be one director for the whole season, and they're going to function more as a showrunner, or they might split it between two directors. But it's a more creatively engaging process, I think, in Europe, but also more demanding in terms of time.
Since you're like about to shoot in Italy, something that comes to my mind is locations. I saw a movie recently on Netflix that was supposed to be shot part of that in Cuba, and it was in Cuba. It was clearly, because I've been to Cuba many times, that was in Cuba, probably was Puerto Rico or something else. When it comes to location, how important is to be truthful to the location? And do you think it plays a role in actually shooting where things are supposed to happen? Or, faking, I don't know, Florida, faking Italy and shooting like in Florida or some other place. Yeah. You think as a director, as a writer, not as an audience, like a viewer, but how do you feel about it? What are your like?
That's a great question. I think that production is so driven by money concerns, by what things cost, that there will be cases where the location becomes incredibly important. Let me back it up. Like the show Breaking Bad, right, was written to be in Los Angeles, in Riverside County, but it was too expensive. So they asked Vince Gilligan, the guy who created the show, they said, well, we want to move it to New Mexico because there's a tax rebate in New Mexico. And he ended up really exploiting that city of Albuquerque, became such a character in that show, is where the location and the show became sort of melded together. And when you're working on that show, sometimes you felt like you were living in the story because it was so intermeshed. But then you'll get situations where a show might be set in, because it's too expensive to go to the real places, they fake things up a lot. Like they just made a series about Oriana Fallaci, the Italian journalist, and it was supposed to be set in like Santa Monica and London and Rome and Florence, and they shot almost the whole thing in Rome. Like they were doing Santa Monica in Fregene, and they were doing, and that was just driven. And for London, they went to Bulgaria because it was cheaper. And even the thing I'm working on now is all supposed to take place on the Amalfi Coast, but it's too expensive. It's expensive to put people in hotels, and it's not very accessible. So we might go for a couple weeks to the Amalfi Coast, and then the rest of it is going to be, part of it's going to be in a town called Sperlonga, which is 2 hours south of Rome. And then there's scenes that are supposed to be in Naples, but we're not going to shoot them in Naples. We're going to shoot them in a little town north of Rome. So there's a lot of cheating, and it's all driven by what the cost of doing things.
Another question I have is about cultural heritage. Do you think, as for what you've seen, for your experience, like a director, writer, like cultural heritage plays a role in their work? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be related. You know, they don't have to write or direct something that, you know, is shot in Italy or has to do with Italy, or, you know. But do you think there is a particular approach that you've seen it with somebody's background in their own work?
That's interesting. I mean, from my own perspective, I would say like the only time my heritage, I had fun with it because half my family's Jewish, was when we made this independent movie. We thought like it's so played out to see Italian gangsters all the time. We thought it would be fun to have Jewish gangsters, because there were a lot in New York between like 1900 and 1945. There were a lot of Jewish gangsters. So that particular movie, the mob boss and the different guys in the mob were all Jewish. But other than that, I have to say, like, in terms of my heritage, what I love about my job is that I love to visit different worlds and try to get my head inside, you know, different cultural spaces. And sometimes I feel like my job is more to be like a sponge and soak up other, you know, that's what's interesting I find about being a director, is that you get to be a tourist and you get to try to put your head into some other, which is probably, I guess things now have become more, polarized isn't the word, but now everyone needs to be a specialist a little bit more. Everyone's supposed to stick into their own group, only write things about their own group, or like, you know, it's sort of like, I guess there's more of a demand for authenticity now.
Well, a question I also asked to the previous speakers on that note is like, do you think that now with, you know, all the politically correctness, woke movement, we reach a point as artists, writers, directors, that you feel there certain things that you feel that you would like to, you know, probably shoot, but you can't because you think that you're gonna break somebody's sensitivity. We have like different, you know, point of views in the past. But you think that, you know, compared to maybe, you know, when you started your career, or even like 15, 20 years ago, there probably wasn't, you know, so complicated, or like wasn't like so in the goods and the bads. But you think that kind of like, you feel like it's a little bit like constricting? Like,
that's a really good question. I mean, I guess like the best way to illustrate as an example is that I was teaching a film course, and one of the students said, "Hey, what's one of the favorite things you've ever done?" And I was like, "You know what? I made this pilot like 17 years ago. It was like a cop show. It was a comedy. It was like Bradley Whitford was playing this washed-up detective, and he had a young partner." And, it was just such a funny show. And they never picked it up, but they made the pilot. And I was like, "Oh, I'll show you the pilot." And there's this scene where Bradley Whitford, in his in his squad of detectives, there's like an African-American guy, a Chinese guy. And there's this scene where he was giving everyone an inappropriate nickname. And I was playing it in the class, and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm going to get reported to HR for showing this." So I think it's good. On the one hand, I think it's amazing that people are more aware, and they think about the implications of what's said, and they think about cultural sensitivity. That's good. But on the other hand, I guess there is like a little bit on the left. There is a little bit of people feeling constrained by the left, and on the right, there's just a lot of like rage and hatred.
Well, you shot many different types of movies, and I guess to go deeper into that question is like, there's anything that you think that you shot that can be like, violence, sexual, whatever it is, you shot in the past that you think that now you would not be able to do exactly in the same way?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you tell what comes to mind?
I can't say because I'll be canceled.
Well, do you think it was more like on like the violence like level, or?
Oh, I don't. I mean, I
or more
don't
like
think there's
graphic.
graphic. I don't think there's anything specifically. I guess I've done that. That is. You mean like on 30 Rock? I worked on that show in the early days, and there's definitely episodes of that show which you wouldn't pass.
You can get away.
We couldn't get away with anymore, I think, if you put it through the more modern filter. But violence, there never seems to be any constraints on violence in the American entertainment. Violence, it seems like I was watching John Wick on the airplane. He must kill like 500 people in that movie. It's like anything goes.
But never
it's
an animal.
Unfortunate, yeah.
You can't really kill an animal. I mean,
right.
That's like I learned that from film school. You can't really kill an animal, but you can kill people.
Yeah, exactly. I was working on once. I was doing an episode of Breaking Bad, and it was like this long episode. It took place in the laboratory, and there's like the character of Victor gets murdered by Giancarlo Esposito's character, kills him at the end, and he cuts his throat, and there's all this blood coming out of his throat. And the people at the network, which was AMC at the time, they said, "Well, you really got to tone down that scene. That is way too violent." And the writer of the show said, "What do you mean way too violent? Like, you guys make a zombie show where you like rip people open and pull out their guts." And they were like, "Well, those are dead people."
And so other question about you is like, there was a point in your career where you felt that you needed to show more about your heritage. Like, can be either Jewish or Italian, but you felt like, in this work, in this project, I need to go an extra mile because it makes a difference.
I wish I could think of that moment, but no, it's funny. I don't know. I mean, I guess I've always, until recently, I've sort of like felt like I've been invisible in terms of my heritage because everyone just looks at your last name. So I always felt like I was secretly Italian. I never got any credit for being Italian because people just make an assumption based on your name.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Which is like reductive. And other question is for you is like, if you have to portray like for like a young writers, some are in the room, if you have to portray like societies as is right now when it comes to the cultural background, but without falling into stereotypes. We were with a previous speaker who spoke about stereotypes, like Italian Americans, gangsters, mafia. That's what kind of like, but that's not just that. And so if for like a new writers, you as a director, say, what would you suggest to do in order to like portray a cultural heritage, but not falling into the stereotypes that we've seen before.
That's a great question. I think it's just you write what you know. You know what I mean? You write the authentic things that you know about your own family and your own heritage. And I think there are all these great new shows now that are set in different ethnic communities. The show Beef, anyone seen that? It's hilarious. It's all in LA, different Asian American communities in Los Angeles, and all the subtle differences between the Japanese community and the Korean community, and it's a comedy, and it's very well done. But I think you sort of write, I think for anyone that's starting out writing, it's sort of like if you just base it on your own life and things you really know and your own authenticity, you'll get better results.
What do you see now in the TV realm going, being more like looked after, like when it comes to genre? Like, there was a moment I remember back in the early 2000s, there was romantic comedy. Now romantic comedy seems like nobody really is scary anymore. Yeah. I guess horror movies always been what's called money in the bank, because you make it for little and you can always make some little. Yeah. But what do you see now, like the new trend in TV? Do you see there's any particular genre that is kind of like people, studios or production company are like looking for more than others?
God, that's a great question. I think the studios never get tired of big tentpole things, big science fiction things. The studios love stuff that's based on existing intellectual property that was successful in the past. So they'll make a series based on Star Wars. They'll make a series based on Lord of the Rings, because they feel like there's somehow an insurance policy built in if they're going to spend a lot of money. I worked on a science fiction show called Silo, which is about a community of people that lives underground. It was for Apple, but that was based upon a really popular series of books. So I think like the studios, when they have something concrete that they know has been popular with the public, they feel more comfortable moving ahead than they would with an original idea. And then in terms of ideas that are original, then often there's a lot more comfort if they're moving with an idea from a showrunner or a creator that's done a very popular show in the past. They'll always feel like, so I think like, I'm just trying to hold out as an example, like Vince Gilligan, who created Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. I think if he has like an idea that's different, completely original, not based on anything, there's going to be a lot, the studios and the networks will be a lot more feel more comfortable taking a risk on that because he's had enormous success already. Does that make sense?
And when it comes to movies, I'm going to ask a question that's very a little bit sensitive. What is the best movie that you can recall, and what's the worst movie that you can recall, or you would like to forget?
The best movie that I've ever seen?
That you saw recently, or it can be also a TV show,
Yeah.
And why?
Okay. The best TV show I saw recently was called Gaslit. Anyone see that? It was like it was a historical. It was maybe 6 or 8 parts. It was all based on the Watergate break-in in the 70s, but it was told from the perspective of Martha Mitchell, who was the wife of the Attorney General, and she was actually telling everyone the truth, but she was silenced because the Republicans painted her as someone who was unstable and alcoholic, and they tried to silence her, but she was actually telling everyone the truth. And I thought that was extremely, extremely well done.
And the worst?
God, the worst. I know. I have to ask the audience, what's the worst show last year? Anyone? No. I don't know. It's funny. It's like I generally, like, my friends I hear people talking about a show, and then I'll watch the pilot for the show, but it's often I don't stick out for the whole. I don't stick through for the whole experience.
The old show or the old pilot?
Sorry?
The old show or the old pilot? Do you finish
the whole? I watched the whole pilot.
Okay.
But I have a hard time watching the whole the whole series.
Okay. And what do you think that, how can you define good writing and bad writing?
I think good writing, I think it's a level of, I think the job of any screenwriter and anyone who's directing, you're orchestrating the emotions of the audience, and you're leading them through a story, and there's all different techniques, ways to do that. But I think all good writing is it's all about structure. Good writing is structured extremely well. Bad writing, I don't know. I think if you're watching something, it's hard. I think if you're watching something with bad writing, it just feels like work, right? Because your brain is working so hard to try to figure out what's going on, or I think if you're watching something and you feel like you're working too hard, then that's bad writing. I don't know. I mean, there's a whole genre of fiction which is based on making the audience figure things out, like any Christopher Nolan movie. It's like his technique is like he's chopping up the time frame and he's revealing things slowly, and he's making the audience work, but the audience at the same time is sort of delighting in it. Becomes like a puzzle or a game. But I think that you can't deny the audience information or not explain things. I think it all has to be to a point, or else the audience gets frustrated.
And on that note, do you think that now sometimes like writings is too much self-explanatory? Means like I'm giving you tell you exactly everything that happens because I feel that you can't really get it. Right.
That's right. That's the other flip side of bad writing, which when you're explaining things too much and you're making things too obvious, and the audience it's all being dished out in a way that it just bores the audience because they're getting too much information.
And on the directorial point of view, is almost like when you open a scene, you show a knife, and then you know that knife is going to be used to kill somebody.
Right, exactly.
And going back to, your own work and career, have you found yourself in a moment where your vision was completely different from the one from the writers? Maybe you were already working on a project, the writer wanted to make some changes, and you kind of say, well, does it really?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something that would crop up a lot when you're doing a pilot or a first episode of a series. Because sometimes you read a script and it's so clear in my mind on the page. I see it. Like I know I like a script when I can just see it when I read it, and it becomes very clear to me. And sometimes you'll be working on a pilot and you realize that the writer has a completely different idea about what things are going to look like or what the characters are going to be like. And yeah, that's tricky. Then you have to negotiate that.
And how do you negotiate that?
How do you negotiate it? When you're a director, you're always trying to figure out when to dig in and when not, what battles are worth fighting. So I think you try to show, as much as you can. You try to make it visually as clear as you can. And then sometimes the writer, I think it's tough for the writers because when they're in the act of creating it, they have visuals in their head, and it takes them a little while to move off of that and towards some other realization of what they were doing.
And have you found yourself in a situation where between a writer and an actor, where the actor refused to
Yes.
to deliver the line or say certain things, and the writer say, well, trying to prove his point, and you have to kind of
No, when the writer and the actor have an argument, I just run away. No. I worked on, there was a really interesting show called Bloodline that was set in Florida. It was like a crime. It was a murder mystery surrounding a family. And I was doing an early episode of the show, and the guy playing the father was a very, very famous playwright named Sam Shepard, who was also an actor. He was playing the patriarch of the family. And the particular episode, I was doing, there was like the whole clue, like there was the youngest daughter of the family had died in a boating accident. And at the beginning of the episode, one of the brothers finds a picture of the boat and it says angelfish on it. And at the very end of the episode, there's a series of flashbacks where Linda Cardellini's on the beach and she's seeing like her sister who died running down the beach, and she sees her father coming towards her sister, and it's all sort of like her memory fantasy. And the very last part of the flashback, Sam Shepard is supposed to pick up the little girl and call her angelfish. And then your sister would go like, oh no, like he named the boat after the girl, and it's supposed to solve the whole mystery of the episode. But Sam Shepard refused to say the word angelfish. He could, so the writer was crying and having a heart attack. I can't remember what happened. No.
And do you think, going back to like, Italian American, do you think that now young, American directors, they want to tell an Italian story or something that deals with Italian American culture, have less material available because what kind of have been seen is only like crime related to mafia from like many years ago. And now, in Italy, is with mafia is not the Godfather anymore. It's very super high tech computer and everything like that. So unless it's a period piece that is set back in the time, even when it comes to crime, contemporary crime, mafia crime, is not.
It's not the same thing.
It's not the same thing.
I know. I think you're touching like on something really interesting, because I feel like both from the Italian American point of view and what comes out of Italy, there's like a lot of the shows that are exported have to do with the Gomorrah, they have to do with the mafia, and there's not a lot of stuff that really has broken through coming out of Italy, which is not crime related. There's like My Brilliant Friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what else.
No, there are a few series, but the fact that you're right,
breaks through.
They don't. People don't see them as an Italian series, although they are about like contemporary. For example, about in Italy now the problem, which is also here, but of immigration. Now there are series about the problem of immigration, what inclusion, immigration, racism.
Right.
Which before is like, oh, Italy wouldn't really associate immediately with like, oh, they're like racist as cases happen here in the United States. Every day we read on the newspaper.
Right.
Well, yes, there are.
Right.
And now the TV, the Italian TV portrayed that. There are shows about how immigration is. Now, probably, yes, they were not going to make, even though they are available on streaming, people now gonna watch them because that's not how they
see
it. They associate it. It's not the White Lotus. And
the Italians hate White Lotus. They hate. When you go to Italy, they hate White Lotus season 2 because they feel like it's a terrible depiction of Italians.
And plus, they made that. Raise the price in that location where Italian used to go on vacation, now can't go anymore.
Right, they've wrecked it as a vacation spot. But I think it's something I hear people talk about, like in Rome, in Italy, which is like, how can we come up with new content that will be interesting on an international basis, that's just not based in all these stereotypes of gangsters and criminals. And I think it also like is something that has plagued like Italian Americans, right? Which is always like this associated with the mafia, the Cosa Nostra. It's a creative challenge.
Yeah, it comes to my mind when I was working with Spike Lee, and I suggested him a book, which was The Miracle of Sant'Anna, which eventually did a movie, which I thought it was a very Italian story. It was about these Black American soldiers during World War II getting trapped in a little town in Tuscany and surrounded by the Nazis and the fascists, and it was a relationship with the Italian that practically saved them. And I thought that was a different Italian story to tell.
It's a great story.
And unfortunately, it was underrated, and probably because of that reason, because that's not what people when you think about Italy, associate immediately to that.
Yeah, I think Americans have a certain, we've talked about this before, Americans have a certain vision, glamorous vision of Italy, which is based on movies they've seen and going on vacation, which doesn't really correlate to what everyday life is like for Italians. And then when you go to Italy, they all have this glamorous idea of the United States, which maybe doesn't completely correlate to what you find
it comes
when you
also
get-
the fact there's also the La Dolce Vita, all that kind of things that again is there's something that it was a movie that Fellini never wanted to make, La Dolce Vita, but was kind of part of a contract he has with De Laurentiis or Ponti, I don't remember exactly, which is like, well, you have to make this movie. He wanted to do 8.5, so that okay, we'll make it 8.5, but the producer said, well, you need to make a very commercial movie as well. But there's something that Fellini was like, couldn't care less about making that movie.
That's so interesting.
And that fact it actually then became, now we use that kind of terms to describe some Italian lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then they did again like La Grande Bellezza, the Big Beauty, which again was what we call like an Oscar movie, because it is exactly what in Italy didn't have any success, that movie, but it was made for.
It was made for consumption in the United States.
Correct.
Yeah, I didn't like it for that reason.
It was completely So, and how do you see now? With the streaming platforms, this international co-production. Where do you see that going? Do you think it's actually gonna probably, I guess, like bridge out? We will know more about what's going on in the rest part of the world beside Italy, allowing more or do you think it's just gonna be local product? They're just gonna be seen somewhere else?
That's really interesting. I think all the European countries want to do what they call glocal. They all want to make series that become consumed on an international basis, because if you're just Spanish or Italian making movies for your own country, that's only like 60 million people, right? But if you're doing stuff that catches on in the US, all of a sudden that's 360 million. So there is a big emphasis on trying to do international productions where perhaps they're shot in English. And I think the challenge ends up being the supply of English language writers. I think there are a lot of writers in the US that would love to be working in Europe, but the thing that makes that really difficult are the American unions and the American guilds, like the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild. It's super expensive. Like in Europe, they make incredible looking shows for maybe half the budget of what they're made for in the US. And part of that is because they don't have the same costs in terms of the guilds and unions of the American.
Do you think that, I guess we were speaking before about dubbing, the fact that now you can watch movies, Italian movie, Korean movies, like dubbed in your own language, which in Europe has been around forever, because we grew up watching dubbed movies. So, you don't hear Robert De Niro or George Clooney's voice, you hear an Italian actor dubbing, which actually most of the actors from Marcello Mastroianni, Vittorio Gassman, they come from being dubber. They were dubber before, actually.
Alberto
Sordi before were actor, Anna Magnani. So the question I have is, do you think that dubbing would play a bigger role in the future, or you think the people is still gonna be used to read the subtitles if it's in their own original language?
I think that Americans, as we were discussing earlier, Americans seem to not like dubbing that much and to prefer to read the subtitles. But the crazy thing now is with artificial intelligence, you can make any actor speak any language. And that technology exists right now. Like you could take this talk that we're giving right now and you could say, Adam's going to speak German, and the AI could change everything I'm saying into German and also change what my mouth is doing. So I predict that in the future, movies are going to be made in whatever the local languages, and then they're going to be dubbed. Well, I don't know what you call it, AI dubbing. Like the language will get changed, but they'll be able to use the actual actor's voice in the other language and actually animate that actor's mouth. So, because Americans are allergic to kind of when the mouth and the sound and the movement of the mouth doesn't line up correctly. Americans don't like that.
And talking about AI, since we are on the subject, is like, do you think the AI is going to replace writers? We have writers that, before they actually say that probably that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's what they are discussing the union. But do you think that, the AI is going to replace writers, going to replace directors, it's going to replace eventually actors? How far do you think it's going to go?
I think it's going to go really far. No, I don't know. There's programs that are accessible to anyone on the internet that you can create your own AI movie. And there's like amazing. If you get a chance, you can Google a film called "Thank You for Not Answering," which was made by an artist, and he just took a series of. First, he used an AI program to describe some still images. He goes. To generate some specific still images. Then he was able to put those still images into an AI 3D rendering program. And there are all these incredible images of like people on a train underwater and like this couple and they're like aging. I mean, it's amazing what it's able to do. I think the economics, I mean, it's terrible to say this. I think the economics of filmmaking are going to arrive at a point where you never go to a place to shoot a movie. Because the most expensive thing about making a movie or TV show is bringing like 200 people to Times Square and there's 20 trucks and 20 Teamsters. And I think at a certain point, it seems like the studios, the people who are putting up the money will say like, well, why should we pay all this money when we can take a digital camera to Times Square, we can sample Times Square, we can shoot our actors on a soundstage in an environment, they have these things called LED volumes now. I've never used one, but they're like 360-degree environments where all the backgrounds are projected into LED walls. So they don't bring the actors to the location, they just sample the location, they project it on the LED walls. So I think all the crafts AI is going to give them a run for directing. It's like you can Google. There's something you can Google on YouTube, and it's like Star Wars as directed by Wes Anderson, and it's done by AI, and it's like hilarious. But the AI, it's scraping everything. The AI is learning off of everything that's ever been made, and it can assimilate what it means to make a Wes Anderson movie. It's like, oh, okay. There's a consistent color palette and the shot is symmetrical and it's a wide lens and whatever. The performer is looking almost into the camera. Like the AI can learn what signifies a Wes Anderson movie. So sadly, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it seems like since everything is driven by economics, it feels like it's moving in that direction. And even during the writer's strike, that was a huge subject with the writers, is that they didn't want screenplays to be. There's something called Chat GPT. I'm sure you've all used it to write your term papers. No, sorry, but it's like Chat GPT. You can say like, oh, like I asked Chat. My dad once met an actor named Telly Savalas in an elevator, and I said, write a scene between Ira Bernstein and Telly Savalas, where they talk about how they like being bald, and then Telly Savalas gives Ira his lollipop. And it wrote the scene. It wasn't terrible. And then it was like, and every time I asked it to do it again, the scene got slightly better. And I've actually talked to people who run TV shows that said that the dangerous thing, they said the AI is as good as the worst writer in my writer's room, which is dangerous. And part of like what people do when they're in a writer's room is they're bouncing ideas, right? Like the head writer doesn't have an infinite number of ideas. So they have a room full of people that are drawing on their personal stories or their sense of humor, and they're throwing ideas around. But now it's like the AI almost becomes becomes an entity that you can bounce ideas off of. Like I could say, can give me 10 plots for an Italian crime movie set in the 70s that involves the Red Brigades. And I'll ask AI, and each plot can be one paragraph, and it will spit out 10 plots. And maybe they're not all great plots, but it will actually generate ideas. And if you think about what creativity is every movie you've ever watched, every book you've ever read, every song you've ever heard, and they're all sort of banging around. And when you're doing something creative, you're subconsciously drawing upon the things that you've seen. And I think the AI is, in a way, it's mimicking our creative process.
And then before I open the Q&A, I would like to ask, what are like the directors, films that mostly inspire you or still inspiring you?
I always love Steven Soderbergh. He's so prolific, and everything he does is so effortless. The Fincher stuff is amazing because the level of craftsmanship is so high. I guess she's maybe, I don't know, she's 30 or 40, Italian woman, Alice Rocco.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say the last name?
Rottweiler.
She has a German last name. She does wonderful movies, and they're very kind of magical realism. I like her. I don't know. I guess those are three.
Okay. And do you think that with, since you've done TV quite a bit, and do you think that, with the streaming platforms, like people are going to go less, and the movie theater are going to disappear? Spielberg said no, but...
yeah, I think there's I think for big event movies, people are still going to go to the movies. It's sort of like grown-up movies that are about ideas and relationships. TV has sort of like taken over that. Like when I was a kid, that was at the movie theater, like serious grown-up themes. But now that's kind of become the province of cable streaming television. But for big event movies, Oppenheimer, Barbie, people still want to go to the movies to have that immersive experience.
Yeah, if they don't last 4 hours.
As long as they don't last for 4 hours. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so now I would like to know if you guys have any question pertaining, writing, directing, question they want to ask Adam, please come to the mic.
I just had a question as a current filmmaking student. What would you recommend for somebody looking into cinematography or directing to look for coming out of college for the future, for now? You mean like once you're done with college? Mm-hmm. I always think like you just start any place that you can. I'll give you two pieces of advice, because one of the pieces of advice is that advice that I had received and when I was in your position, and I thought it was great advice, is that you think about who your favorite directors are, you think about your favorite show, like write a letter to those people. I mean, who knows? Sometimes those letters get answered. When I made my first music video, I thought of my favorite directors, and I sent my video to Jonathan Demme, and the guy called me up, and I got to work for him. So it doesn't hurt to take a shot, right? And so take the high shot. At the same time, just enter the business wherever you can enter it. I mean, it might not be like exactly the kind of product that you're interested in. It might not be the exact position you're interested in, but everyone's got to start. You got to sort of start on a grunt level, getting people coffee. And then I think you just work really hard. If you work super hard and you're nice to work with, people will remember you, and it will lead to something else. It always will. Even if you have the worst job, I have to say, even like the worst jobs I've ever done, I've always met someone at that job that I'm glad that I met them. That either I got to work, either like they remembered me and I worked with them in a different context, or, I was doing one job which
wasn't a great job, but there was a young guy doing props, and I was like, this guy's brilliant. And then someone I ended up working with a lot later. So I would say, like, you can't always pick your, because filmmaking production, it's like the army, it's divided into different departments. Everyone starts as a PA. You work your way up in a department. And I would say, and if it's what interests you is creative stuff, writing, directing, it's like always make your own, never let go of making your own stuff. Even if you're working a job to support yourself, it's like what's really wonderful now is how democratic making content is. Like when I was in my 20s, if I wanted to make a short film, I had to buy film stock, I had to rent equipment, I had to pay the laboratory, I made a short film in 1986 that cost me 20 grand that I had saved up. If you adjust for inflation, that's a lot of money right now. Now it's like you can pull your phone out of your pocket and you can make a 4K image on your phone and you can cut it on your laptop and you can do all your mixing and all your effects. It's like so available to everyone. And I would say, just keep on making your own stuff. And it doesn't, you know what I mean? And don't be paralyzed by that it has to be great. I think it's just the amount of stuff that you do and you keep doing it and you like find actors, you pull your friends in, you write your scripts, you get ChatGPT to write it for you. But it's, I think it's like just flexing the muscle if you want to do something creative.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? No one? Yeah, if you have a question, please go to the mic. Yeah, please.
So I have a question. So for students who are aspiring writers, could you talk about how your personal reading has affected the way you've become a writer? Like, where do you get your ideas from? What has influenced you? What kind of literature? Things like that.
I mean, I have to admit, I'm ashamed to admit I'm not much of a writer since I've been mostly working as a director, but I could say that in directing and my friends who are writers, it's like often a great way to start is just to imitate someone that you imitate a style or imitate a writer that you really admire. And you just sort of like inhabit that style, and it might not end up being your style for the rest of your life, but it gives you a point of entry. But I'm sorry I couldn't give you a more beefy response to that.
Hi. First of all, thanks for sharing your time with us tonight. And you mentioned that you directed both 30 Rock and Breaking Bad. What is something that you think is applicable from drama that should be like a very important skill in both comedy writing and directing? What's something that from comedy should be more like present in drama, and something from drama that should be more present in comedy?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's funny because I always say, like, when I do a comedy, when I do a drama, I like to find the humor in it.
Okay.
And when you do a comedy, you like to play it straight.
Right.
And I think there's like a crossover between the two. Sure. And sometimes the best dramas have moments of, I guess I referenced Vince Gilligan before, but what makes him such an amazing dramatic writer, a writer of stuff that's really gripping and tense, is that he's also super funny. Right. So it's sort of like an escape valve for the audience. And then by the same token, I think some of my favorite comedies, even if you look at things like Parks and Rec or whatever, like people are playing it really straight.
It's true.
And I think that comedy should look like dramas.
Okay. So then I guess a secondary question would be, what would your approach be if Tina Fey wrote Breaking Bad and Vince Gilligan wrote 30 Rock?
Oh, wow. I mean, my directing approach?
What would be your directing approach for those episodes then?
I think it'd be almost the same.
Really? Okay. Awesome.
Maybe the scripts would be different.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other question? Well, if you're too shy, Adam is going to be here a few minutes after, so you can ask in person as well. Please come.
I don't know much about film, but I do have a question that I see all over like social media, and it's about remaking classic movies like Cinderella and Ariel, and I want to know what your thoughts behind that are.
Oh, that's a good question. Are you talking about like the parodies? Because now
Disney is like they're making new movies, but they're changing the whole story, the characters,
and they're updating it and making it more contemporary. I mean, part of it ties into what I was saying before, which is like in the world of studios and networks, there's this great. I think they do that because they love intellectual property. They love things that they already own. So Disney already owns Cinderella, so they can remake it. I'm sorry to be all about money, but they can remake it without paying for new intellectual property. And like, for instance, like Fargo, the TV show, which was like a popular TV show, the genesis of that show was that MGM owned the movie Fargo. And a producer, Warren Littlefield, I believe he's the guy that instigated it. He was the producer, and he went to MGM and he goes like, you guys own this movie. You could make a great show out of it. So a lot of those remakes come out of stuff that exists in the library. And it's because they own it. They don't have to pay for new property, but also because it's kind of embedded in the popular consciousness. They feel like it will give it a little bit of a lift in terms of people going to see it.
Interesting. Thanks.
Sure.
Any other question? Please.
I'm very intrigued by the range of your directorial kind of history in terms of the music videos, working with bands, and obviously having an affinity for music, and then both television and film. And I guess the question in all of this is more like you've worked with a lot of talent, and some of it is obviously, some of them have probably been easier to work with, some less so. Are you willing to tell us some of your favorite actors you've worked with over the years and why, and maybe even some of your least favorite actors?
Oh, wow, that's so much fun. No. Favorite actors? Well, okay. Well, I mean, I would say, I'll try not to be too long-winded, but I think like there's like actors fall into different categories, right? Like there's some actors are like super methody, meaning that like everything has to be real. Like they have trouble like conjuring up the performance unless it's rooted in some type of veracity, which is a valid way of, and some actors are like, I call them like the super pros. Those are actors that like, they've just been doing it a long time and they're technically really proficient and they almost delight in doing stuff which is difficult, because acting for the camera, it's this weird mixture of acting and photography, right? So the director never wants to like pin the actors into something super artificial just because it makes your shot work. But by the same token, the actor constantly is doing artificial things because they're doing it for a camera. Do you know what I mean? Just like the position of their face, where they go in the room, they have to accommodate the shot. So, I would say like, I worked for years on a show called Californication, which was with a guy named Dave Duchovny, who I'd known for a long time because I actually gone to school with him. And he was like just like a pitch perfect actor that would kind of do it perfectly in 2 takes, but also like he had this great technical ability. And I was doing this really complicated scene. It was like a big party scene. And I had plotted it all out on a piece of paper, who was going where. And all of a sudden the whole thing blew up because the guest star came in, he had broken his foot. He couldn't walk. So he had to be in a chair. And all of a sudden on the spot, like I had to like restage the scene. And I knew that like David had to be like by the door at the end because someone else was, and I was just, and usually an actor wants like a specific motivation, much easier for them if like there's a glass of water on the podium. So easier for me as an actor to go to the podium because I want to drink a water. But I couldn't really think of a reason to get Dave over to the door. And it happened with other actors like Jonathan Banks, where like they see like the pain that you're in, because all of a sudden your plan is falling apart, and he's like, "It's all right. I'll do that for you. Yeah, and they like think of their own reason to get to the door. So that's kind of like for a director, that's the most fun, is when, you know, when people are feeling your pain and suffering and kind of helping you out. And like the flip side is like what I would call like the super alpha actor, right? The actor who doesn't want to be told anything. They sort of like feel like they're in charge, and you have to kind of tiptoe around them, and you can never tell them exactly what you want them to do because they'll just do the opposite thing. And I was doing like the first season of 30 Rock. I was doing a scene between Tina Fey and Alec Baldwin, and she and what happened in the scene before is that she was in the writer's room and everyone was angry at her, and they had thrown food all over her. She was covered in food, and she's walking down the hall and she runs into her boss, played by Alec Baldwin, and it's just written like they stop for a second, they look at each other, and then they keep going. And so I'm setting up the scene, and I'm like, okay, well, I think like you guys are walking down the hall, and then and then like maybe you pass each other, and then you stop, and then you look at each other, and then you go on. So we do it once, and the Alec Baldwin's like, no. And I'm like, what's the matter? No, this is not right. And I was like, well, what do you think? And he's like, we don't pass each other. We stop. We just approach, we stop, we look at each other, and then we go. And I'm like, okay. It didn't really change that much for me. And I was like, fine, let's do it like that. We do a couple takes, and I was like, no, not right. And I was like, what's the matter? And he goes, this is not right. And I was like, well, what do you think? And he's like, I think we should walk down, we should pass each other, stop, and then keep going. I was like, that's a great idea. Let's do it like that. So that's my show business story.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I guess we can, finish here. And then again, if you guys have questions, again, I want to thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.